Hello, I'm Maria Madise, and I'm delighted to welcome you back to the Family and Life Academy and to our course on Divine Law, presented by Father Thomas Green, a Dominican friar and priest. This course is made up of 6 lessons and covers the origins of the Divine Law in the Old Testament, how this paved the way for the Gospel of Jesus Christ, and how the Gospel of Grace is continued in the law of the Church. In the first lesson, Father Green considered divine law as forming part of God's revelation to mankind and its development culminating in the old law given to Moses for the people of Israel. In the second lesson, he will consider particular moral questions of the law of Moses in greater detail. And at the end of the lesson, Father Green will answer your questions, which you can put in the chat window at any time during the lesson. Hello, Father Green. I will now hand over the stage to Father.
Thank you, Maria.
Please.
Thank you very much. So today I want to consider the morality of the old law, the law given by God to Moses for the people of Israel. So as we saw last time, theologians normally distinguish 3 kinds of precept within the law of Moses: ceremonial, moral, and judicial. And we saw that the ceremonial precepts were those that pertain to the worship of God, whether by describing how that worship was to take place, or how the people of Israel were to be separated from the pagan nations and kept ritually pure. The moral precepts described how the people in general were to practice the virtues in their daily lives, while the judicial precepts described the penalties that the judges had to impose for certain kinds of offences. Now, today, the session is about the morality of the old law, and specifically about whether we can say that this law was morally excellent. And so I shall speak naturally most about the moral precepts, but I shall also touch on the judicial ones, as we want to see whether or not these maintained a high standard of justice among the people. I'll begin with a rather long but interesting quotation from Elizabeth Anscombe. She, as you may know, was a Catholic philosopher who died about 20 years ago. It's from a talk called Prophecy and Miracles that she gave in the late 1950s. She's imagining a man who is a pagan, but who has a belief in the existence of one God, and consequently a contempt for idolatry, and who one day comes across the law of Moses and begins to study it. And she sketches what she thinks would be the reaction of such a man. She writes, "I will suppose this man to have heard little of Christianity and to have his interest caught by the Old Testament. He skips the ceremonial and purificatory prescriptions as of no interest to him. He does not admire this law just because it prescribes things that accord with his own views. It does that in part, no doubt, but in part he finds it instructive. For example, it greatly heightens his own notion of the paramountcy of God. It absolutely forbids superstition, seeking truths from the dead, concern with omens, soothsaying. If we suppose him acquainted with, say, Arabian tribes of the fiercer sort, we can also suppose that he is struck by the prescriptions tending to check the license and bloody revenge natural among such people, the arrangements tending to make impossible the casual jettisoning of wives and the killing of those who have suddenly or accidentally killed your relations. He notes the prohibition on punishing any but the offender. Remember that even Roman law, as codified by a Christian emperor, permitted the destruction of the family and close associates of a man if he is found guilty of treason against the state, but the Mosaic law forbade it. There is no torture in the Mosaic law. Remember again that the Code of Justinian retained the requirement to torture slaves as witnesses. He notes the fact that if you so much as knocked out the tooth of a slave, he was to go free. The asylum to runaway slaves from the nations round about, the prohibition on man-stealing, the provision whereby you could not send a slave or bondman away if he married in your house and chose to remain, the provisions forbidding persecutions of poor debtors. He sees the contrast between the estimation of offences against property, the penalty being n-fold restitution, where n ranged from 2 to 6, and offences against the person and sexual offences. He sees the death penalty prescribed for idolatry, blasphemy, murder, sodomy, bestiality, adultery, and even fornication by or with a betrothed virgin. And this indeed strikes him as perhaps rather doubtful, so much death penalty for some rather common offences, but in every other regard he is impressed by the law and the ethic as something incomparably superior to what is usually found in codes of law, which usually seem designed in some way at least to flatter avarice and power, and for the respect of persons and the oppression of many of those subject to them, and above all the glorification of those who have supreme power. That's the end of the quotation. So such, this philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe suggests, would have been the impression made on a thoughtful pagan monotheist by the morals of the old law. Such a person would have been inclined to find it admirable in general and in many of its details, though perhaps finding it surprisingly strict on sexual morality. And Elizabeth Anscombe adds that the very influence of these Hebrew ethics on Western civilization has made us for a long time unable to see just how distinctive and admirable they are in comparison with pagan ethics. Hebrew morals have been, we might say, simply the air that we breathe. So much, she says, against the shedding of innocent blood. Who would find that remarkable in the last few centuries? Now, with the West abandoning this ethic, it becomes possible to see it again. Anscombe spoke of the law of Moses as waging war against what she calls the natural meanness and cunning of human beings. Here we might think, for example, of the precept in Exodus 23, verses 4 to 5. If you meet your enemy's ox or ass going astray, bring it back to him. If you see the ass of him that hateth thee lying underneath his burden, thou shalt not pass by, but you shall lift him up with him. In other words, you shall help even the person who hates you in his time of need. I'm struck also by the old law's tenderness. We've already heard how the householder who is angry with a slave and punches him in the mouth, and who thereby knocks out even one tooth, was obliged to let the man go free. We could also mention the law that forbids a newly married man from being called up to fight in the army within a year of his marriage. And so Deuteronomy 24:5 says, "When a man has lately taken a wife, he shall not go out to war, neither shall any public business be enjoined on him. He shall be free at home without fault, that for 1 year he may rejoice with his wife." The law even anticipates modern environmental concerns in what it says about avoiding deforestation or besieging an enemy city. You besiege a city for a long time, says Deuteronomy 20, making war against it in order to take it. You shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them, for you may eat of them, but you shall not cut them down. Are the trees in the field men, that they should be besieged by you? So much for some of the first impressions that might be made on us by the moral precepts of the old law. I want now, before moving on to some particular moral problems, to see if we can speak about these precepts in a more systematic way. Well, in general, since the old law came from God, we must believe that it is all good, since God obviously can't reveal a bad law. So St. Paul says in Romans chapter 7, verse 12, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good. And in that verse, the word law seems to mean the old law taken as a whole, and the word commandment seems to mean the individual precepts. The adjectives holy and just and good therefore correspond respectively to the ceremonial, judicial, and moral precepts. Our Lord himself confirms the goodness of the law, especially its moral precepts, when he says to the rich young man, if you would enter life, keep the commandments. St. Thomas Aquinas proposes that there are three kinds of moral precept in the law. There are some, he says, which speak of duties so obvious that nobody can judge wrongly about them, even though, of course, they may act against them. An example of these, he gives commands to love God and one's neighbour. And he thinks these were not included in the 10 Commandments precisely because they are so obvious. Then there is a second class of commandment. These are a bit more detailed. Most people will spontaneously recognize them as true, even without much education, but people can go wrong about them, especially if they've been brought up in a bad environment. As an example of this kind of precept, he mentions the command not to steal. He quotes Julius Caesar, who in his book The Gallic War says that the Germans of his time were so lacking in education and civilization that they don't see anything wrong with theft. I don't know whether or not that was true, but it's conceivable that people could be in that condition. And this class of precept, those that are normally obvious even to people who are not especially perceptive, corresponds, says St. Thomas, to the 10 Commandments. And since these precepts are very important, but it is just possible to go wrong about them, it's fitting that they receive an especially dramatic promulgation, which is what happened on Mount Sinai, when, says Exodus 19, the Lord came down upon it in fire, and the smoke arose from it as out of a furnace. And then there's a third class of precept in the law, by which St. Thomas says that the reasons for them are not immediately obvious to people in general, but only to the learned or the wise. And he thinks that all these are extrapolations from one or other of the 10 Commandments. And these also come from God, but they were not promulgated in so dramatic a way, but by Moses or Aaron speaking to the people in person. For example, the first of the 10 Commandments is not to worship a God who is not the creator. Anyone should be able to see why this is just. But later on in Deuteronomy, Moses forbids going to fortune tellers or seeking the truth from the dead. And according to Aquinas, such things are forbidden because they tend towards the idolatry forbidden by the first commandment, even though not everybody spontaneously understands this. Or again, the fourth of the 10 Commandments is honor your parents, but almost everyone sees the importance of this. One way we do this is by honoring those who are of the same generation of our parents. And so in the book of Leviticus, Moses says, rise up before the hoary head. And this is an example of what Aquinas takes to be the third class of moral precept. In general, all the moral precepts in the law of Moses belong to one of these classes. They are either so obvious that nobody can mistake them, or they are one of the 10 Commandments, or else they make one of the 10 Commandments more precise in a way that accords with natural law, but about which people might easily go wrong if God had not revealed them. Well, so much for a systematic account of the moral precepts. Now, for the rest of my talk today, I want to look at some of the clauses in the Law of Moses that are famously problematic because they may seem to run counter to the morality of the gospel or even to natural law. And anti-religious people sometimes allege some of these clauses, whether in good faith or not, as arguments against the inspiration of the Bible. So I won't be talking about the ceremonial precepts that have been abrogated by the gospel. For example, the requirement that believers should sacrifice a she-goat for sins of ignorance. There is no sensible ground for any opponent of Christianity to object that we Christians don't do that kind of thing, since part of being a Christian is to hold that the sacrifices of the old law, though good in their time, have been made obsolete by the cross of Christ. But there is at least a prima facie case against us if we find anything commanded in the law of Moses that we would say is contrary to natural law. Natural law is written on the heart of man by the Creator and is unchanging. So how can God ever command anything incompatible with it? So that's the challenge I want to consider today. And I'll do this by looking rather quickly at 5 moral questions arising from the books of Moses. In the first place, we have what is called the lex talionis. Next, divorce and remarriage. Thirdly, slavery. Fourthly, just war, and the status of non-combatants. And finally, usury. So first, what's called the lex talionis. This is a Latin phrase that might be translated as the law of equivalent retribution. It was originally used to refer to a principle of Roman law, but it's come to be used to passages in the law of Moses that specify penalties for kinds of bodily harm. For example, Exodus 21, 22 to 25. This reads as follows. If men quarrel and one strike a woman with child and she miscarry indeed but live herself, he shall be answerable for so much damage as the woman's husband shall require and as arbiters shall award. But if her death ensue thereupon, he shall render life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And there are similar passages in Leviticus 24 and Deuteronomy 19. Now, such passages are sometimes quoted as if they pose some kind of a problem for us, but I would say they are all self-evidently just. There is a well-known saying that is sometimes but doubtfully attributed to Gandhi. An eye for an eye means the whole world will be blind. I find it hard to understand how this saying ever acquired so much popularity. It should be rather obvious that if the principle of an eye for an eye is applied, then 2 people will be lacking 1 eye each, and the rest of the world will be left as it was. This is not, of course, to say that we're obliged today to punish physical crimes in an equally physical way. Lex talionis in the old law is one of that law's judicial precepts, and as such is not binding on anyone today. Our prisons give us the possibility of condign punishment for at least most offences against the person, while avoiding the kinds of penalties that are distasteful to most of us today, brought up as we are to shrink for the infliction of physical pain on evildoers. But there is no good case for arguing that the lex talionis in the law of Moses is unjust. The next question is a more complicated one. It's the question of divorce and remarriage. And here the relevant passage comes in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4. It reads as follows. If a man take a wife and have her, and she find not favour in his eyes for some uncleanness, he shall write a bill of divorce, and shall give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she is departed and marrieth another husband, and he also hateth her, and hath given her a bill of divorce, and hath sent her out of his house, or is dead, the former husband cannot take her again to wife. What then shall we make of this, given that our Lord says in the Gospel, "What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder"? Well, the first thing to note is that Moses in Deuteronomy does not assert any right to divorce. Hence, when the Pharisees ask Christ about this matter, he replies by asking, "What did Moses command you?" And they are forced to reply not that Moses ever commanded them to divorce their wives, but simply that he allowed it. In other words, Moses in the law assumes that divorce will sometimes happen, no doubt because it was already a custom. What he commands are certain things that will regulate the practice, and in particular, that will lessen it. For example, the offended husband cannot dismiss his wife in a fit of rage. He must write a legal document, which presumably in practice meant that he would have to go to a notary and get one written. When it was written, he couldn't just leave it somewhere for her to find or give it to her via a third party. He must put it into her hand. These provisions are meant to cool his anger and to soften his heart. Finally, he is to know that he can't have her back again once she's gone away and married someone else. This again is to prevent him from acting hastily, but also to prevent her from being degraded, handed back and forth between two men, like a field or a domestic animal. The question nevertheless remains, would the second marriage not have been a sin, since God made marriage indissoluble from the beginning? And if so, is Moses not in some way conniving at sin? Well, there are two alternative answers to this question. One is that the second marriage would have been a sin, and that divorce was only permitted by the old law in the sense that it was not forbidden as something that will be punished in a human court. On this view, the second marriage would still presumably be punished by God, either in this life or the next. The alternative view is that before the gospel, a second marriage was permitted by divine law in a stronger sense, and that the Jews would not be punished for it by God, even in the next life. Well, we're free to take either view, and each of them can quote some good authorities in its favor. To me, it seems that the Jews would have been hardly treated if the law had told them how to conduct a divorce, but failed to tell them that they would nevertheless be punished for it. So it seems to me that without conceding any positive right of a second marriage, since it is contrary to natural law, God at this period manifested his purpose of tolerating it. And this seems possible because it does not seem that he is obliged to punish every sin. We know that he does not punish any sin as much as it deserves. If this is true, God could still have punished evil passions that prompted a man to initiate this or that particular divorce. For example, passions such as lust or hatred, since lust and hatred were things explicitly forbidden in the law of Moses. There's a lot more one could say about that question, but I want now to move to my third topic, which is slavery. In my quotation from Elizabeth Anscombe, we saw some ways in which Moses protected the rights of slaves and how his law differed markedly in that respect from Roman law. Nevertheless, a modern person, seeing slavery treated in the Bible as apparently an unproblematic institution in itself, is likely at least to be surprised, and if he is already hostile to religion, he may well seize upon this as a proof of the inferiority of biblical morality to his own preferred form of ethics. He might well challenge us by saying, "So, do you think slavery is all right? If not, why does your God seem to endorse it?" Well, the first thing we might do in reply is to distinguish slavery understood as chattel slavery from slavery as a state of permanent obligation to labor. In chattel slavery, the slave is understood as literally the possession or chattel of his master. And so the master may do as he wants with the slave without being punished by human law, just as he may do as he pleases with his chairs or tables. Well, that is something indefensible, but as we've seen, it was not countenanced by the law of Moses. If the master so much as knocks out the tooth from his slave's mouth, he must let the man go free. What about servitude or slavery in the second sense, as a permanent obligation to labor, master providing no remuneration beyond the ordinary necessities of life? This too, though not absolutely forbidden, was not seen by the law of Moses as a normal institution. Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 to 18, sets out the relevant precepts. It says this: If your brother, a Hebrew man or Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this today. But if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he fares well with you, then you shall take an awl and thrust it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your bondman forever. And to your bondwoman you shall do likewise. It shall not seem hard to you when you let him go free from you, for at half the cost of a hired servant he has served you 6 years. So the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. So the first thing we see here is that if a man or woman is obliged by poverty to enter a state of servitude, it is only meant to be a temporary solution. After 6 years' work, during which time his board and lodging will have cost the master only about half of the wages of a free man, the slave must be set free, and what's more, the master must furnish him liberally with provisions for making a fresh start in life, with food and livestock. The master has no right to insist that he stay. It is only the man or woman himself or herself who, at the end of the period of indentured servitude, may well have conceived an affection for the household and decide to stay for good. In that case, the person's earlobe is pierced in a symbolic ceremony which, without degrading him, will leave a mark to remind both him and his master of their mutual duties. And so far from being causes of uneasiness to us, I would say that the old law's provisions about servitude were not only not unjust, but were strikingly humane and adapted to the circumstances of their time, and something that the Jews could have felt proud about when they compared themselves to the pagan nations that surrounded them. Our last two topics are warfare and usury. One point to note about both questions is that, contrary to what's sometimes said, the Israelites were not allowed, still less commanded, to nourish any general hostility to non-Israelites. Deuteronomy 23 verse 7 says, "You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. you shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you are a sojourner in his land. So the Edomites were the descendants of Esau, who had been the brother of Jacob, the ancestor of the 12 tribes. So although the Israelites were to keep themselves distinct from other peoples and not intermarry with them, they were not to consider them as unworthy of respect. So this premised, we can turn to Deuteronomy 20 and look at the general principles of warfare. They all, of course, presuppose that some just cause exists for the Israelites to wage war on some other group. And here the Lord draws a sharp distinction between cities inside and cities outside the Promised Land. In regard to cities outside, the Israelites are told that they must first invite the city to surrender, and that if it does not, they may fight against it, and in case of victory, that they are to put all the adult males to the sword. Now that sounds brutal to our ears, but we can presume that the adult males of the city would all have been combatants. The same chapter tells the Israelites that they must not kill the women and children, but rather must take them for themselves back to Israel. Now again, that second part of the precept sounds hard for the women and children, and no doubt in practice it often was. But the alternative would have been worse, namely for them to be left by themselves without any menfolk to support them. So I don't see that any case can be made from this against the justice of the old law. You should also note that the law lays down precepts to prevent foreign women who found themselves in those hard circumstances from being humiliated. So Deuteronomy 21 says that if an Israelite man wishes to take the wife of a deceased foreign soldier to be his own wife, he may do so, but he must first allow her to spend 1 month living in his house to mourn her parents. And after they've married, if he finds that after all they don't suit each other, then he may let her go where she will, but he must not sell her for money or otherwise treat her like a slave. So those were the rules for warfare against foreign cities. Things were different when it came to cities within the Promised Land. These were the cities that at the time of Israel's entrance into the Promised Land of Canaan were inhabited by pagan tribes. The Israelites are told by Moses in Numbers and Deuteronomy to destroy these tribes completely, women and children included. So the question arises, how is this compatible with natural law, which forbids the killing of non-combatants in warfare? Sometimes people suggest the law here was simply permitting the Israelites to follow their natural inclination and implying that they would not be punished by God for doing so. Rather, as I've suggested, that the law implied that in certain circumstances at least, they would not be punished for contracting a second marriage after divorce. The argument seems to be that while killing non-combatants is contrary to natural law, God chose not to punish it in this case, since otherwise the Israelites would have been unwilling to take possession of the land. Well, I don't think that this can be correct. For one thing, the natural inclination of the Israelites would probably not have been to kill all the women and children. I know, of course, that such things happen in war, but pity for the weak and also the wish to find a wife would probably have prevented it from happening universally. But more importantly, the parallel with divorce breaks down because God never tells the Israelites to put aside their wives, whereas here he gives a positive command. Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 to 18 says this: "The cities of these people that the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices, which they have done in the service of their gods. This last phrase, I think, shows us the justification for these wars of total destruction. Almighty God, as we learn from the Book of Wisdom, was using the Israelites as his instruments to punish those pagan tribes for their immoral practices. And from the Book of Wisdom and other parts of Scripture, we learn that those practices included necromancy, bestiality, and burning their children to death in honor of the devil. And also that God had given them many opportunities to repent before the Israelites were commanded to destroy them. In fact, one of the things Israelites were told to do was to tell the tribes, first of all, to give up idolatry before declaring war. In the 16th century, Hernan Cortes, the conqueror of the Aztec kingdom in Mexico, followed a similar policy. He told the Aztec king that his army would not fight if the Aztecs agreed to renounce certain particularly grave violations of the natural law, especially human sacrifice. And as you know, the Aztecs didn't agree to this, so Cortes and his small band fought and won a great victory against all the odds. The last topic is usury, which is lending money at interest. One of the reasons this topic is important is that people who want to change the church's faith in some way or other often allege usury as a precedent for such a change. You hear them say, well, the church used to teach that usury was a sin, and now she doesn't. Well, in fact, that's not correct. Even though we may not hear very much about it, usury remains condemned. Anyway, what does the law of Moses say? We find the answer in two places. First, Exodus 22:25. If you lend money to any of my people that is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. Interestingly, the Hebrew word for interest, neshek, comes from a verb that means to bite like a dog or a snake. The other place is Deuteronomy 23:19, which modifies the command in Exodus in an interesting way. No pun intended. It says, you shall not lend upon interest to your brother. To a foreigner you may lend upon interest, but to your brother you shall not lend upon interest. The question arises, if usury is bad, as the church says, why did the old law allow it in Deuteronomy 23 in the case of an Israelite lending to a Gentile? Well, St. Thomas answers this was to avoid something worse, namely an Israelite lending to a fellow Jew on interest. He writes as follows, that they received usury from foreigners was not granted to them as something lawful, but it was permitted in order to avoid a greater evil, lest they should take usury from the Jews who were worshippers of God. And he adds that just as the Jews were forbidden to take usury from their brothers, that is, from fellow Jews, so we Christians are forbidden to take it from anyone at all, since we are obliged to regard all men as our brothers and neighbors. In other words, I would make the same comment here as I made about divorce and remarriage. This provision in the old law about lending on interest to foreigners was a permission. God revealed through Moses that he would not punish this act at this period of history, even though in itself it is contrary to the natural law. In this sense, we can say the old law was imperfect, though we shall understand this in the sense of being meant for an imperfect people. It was nevertheless perfectly designed for an imperfect people. One final remark on the morality of the old law. Some time back I quoted St. Paul saying, the law is holy, the commandment is holy and just and good. But in the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 20, we find some verses that seem to contradict this. In this chapter, God is speaking through Ezekiel to the people. This is the 6th century BC, and he's summarizing the history of his dealings with the people from the time that he appeared to Moses about 900 years beforehand. And at one point, God says, "I gave them statutes that were not good, and judgments in which they shall not live." Now, this seems very puzzling. How can God speak in Ezekiel of having given statutes that were not good? Especially when St. Paul says that they were good. Well, we don't have time to go into it in detail, but if you read the chapter carefully, you will see that God is talking at that point not of the laws given to Moses on Mount Sinai, such as the Ten Commandments, but of the laws given to the second generation 38 years later, just before they entered the Promised Land. If you remember from last time, these laws make up the book of Deuteronomy. It's when speaking of this part of his own law that God says, "I gave them statutes that were not good." Notice that he doesn't say statutes that were bad, but that were not good. And I think it's significant that in the two areas where I've suggested that God gave a mere permission, in a sense of an undertaking not to punish, namely remarriage after divorce and taking usury from foreigners, both precepts come in Deuteronomy and not in the earlier books. Some authors suggest that God modified his own law on account of the sins that the Israelites had committed during their time in the desert, and especially on account of a great act of apostasy in which they had worshipped the god of the Moabites near the end of that time, just before they entered the Promised Land. These authors point out that Deuteronomy increased their ceremonial duties, especially those of sacrifice and pilgrimage, so that they would have less time and energy for worshipping false gods. But at the same time, it lessened some of their moral duties because of how morally feeble they have made themselves. And this theory seems to me very plausible. And that is another way in which we might say that the old law was imperfect, or rather that it was divinely tailor-made, but for a still very imperfect people.
Thank you. Thank you, Father, for this very instructive overview of all these moral questions. So we have some questions now from our viewers, and the first one is really from last time, that we didn't have time to answer, and it is about the tree of knowledge of good and evil that you spoke about, and the question is whether the tree of knowledge of good and evil stands for the fact that God is the lawgiver, and the eating of its fruit stands for the rejection of God as lawgiver. And the questioner asked if you could possibly comment on this.
Yes, that sounds a very plausible interpretation. I don't think it's incompatible with what I mentioned last week, which is was about it symbolizing the gratuity of God's offer of eternal life. So I mentioned the idea that there had to be some kind of law that went beyond what nature itself requires of us. So yes, I mean, laying hold of a tree that's been described by God as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, doing this against his instruction, it sounds very much like it enacts a claim to determine for oneself what good and evil are, which is obviously rejecting the idea that God is the source of what good and evil are. The eternal nature of God determines itself what good and evil are. So yes, I think that's a good interpretation.
Well, thank you. I hope that answers the question of the of the person who asked it. So what other moral precepts did St. Thomas say were too obvious to include in the Ten Commandments?
Yes, that's an interesting question. In fact, when he's talking about that specifically, he just says the love of God and neighbor and other such like things, which is not very helpful. He often has this phrase, other such like things. I think it was because he was so busy, or perhaps he just thought it seemed obvious to other people because it was obvious to him. But there's a place elsewhere where he's talking about natural law, and he's talking about what he calls the first precepts of the natural law, which he thinks can't be written out of the heart of man. And he mentions things like taking food, so surviving by having something to eat, or bringing up your own offspring, the instinct to live in society, which gives rise to the natural law that we should live in society. And he also mentions knowing or seeking the truth about God. So he seems to think that those things are obvious, that everybody knows that you should do them. And so even though he doesn't say so specifically, I think he would say that's why they're not mentioned in the Ten Commandments. There's nothing in the Ten Commandments to say you should remember to eat sometimes, for example, even though that is an important law.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Here's another question. How should we understand the precept you cited from Deuteronomy, which prescribes a fine for a violent act causing a woman to miscarry, but prescribes the death penalty in the case of the death of the mother?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I quoted it from the Dowie Reams version. The translation of that verse is disputed, and it's rather important because it determines the meaning of the verse. So in the Dowie Reams, it refers to a miscarriage, but literally, I've got a literal version on hand, which says, literally it says, if men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so that the child comes forth, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may determine. But if there is any injury, then you should appoint a penalty, life for life, etc. So many translations understand it as referring not to a miscarriage brought on by the man hitting the pregnant woman, but by referring to a premature birth. And it's because of the premature birth and the dangers that poses to the health of the baby that the fine is administered. So this is this is a disputed point, and it has been among, as far as I can see, among commentators for a long time. And likewise, the second part of that verse is not clear, and this is disputed by the commentators when it says life for life, whether it's just talking about the possibility of the mother dying, in which case it's clear that the man who strikes him has to be put to death, or whether it's talking about the unborn child dying, and whether, if the child dies, whether the man has to be put to death in that case. So the answer is that the verse is, I mean, it's not clear. I mean, presumably it was clear enough at the time when it was given, but it's not. The meaning of it is disputed by both by the rabbis and by Christian commentators, and has been for a long time.
That's really interesting. Right. Well, another question about this precept of eye for eye, but in the teaching of Saint Augustine, the questioner says that he called the principle of an eye for eye and tooth for a tooth something like the justice for the unjust. What did he mean by this? Would you be able to comment?
Yes, I haven't come across that exact phrase in St. Augustine. I'd be a bit surprised if it's literal, because he does discuss this law, what we call the lex talionis, or the law of equivalent retribution, in one of his books in some detail. That's in his book on the Sermon on the Mount. He's got a commentary on that. And what he does there is talk about steps of justice. And well, first of all, he says that there are few people who even live up to that. He says there are a few people who, when they're wronged, don't want to have more back than they lost. And in fact, he says that the person who was living according to the lex talionis would be just, and in fact, he would even be something more than just, because he'd already be conceding something. Because he says, St. Augustine says that actually, when we're wronged, we do have the right to have something more back than was taken from us. Precisely because of the gratuitous nature of the wrong that was done to us. And the fact that this is borne out in some other parts of the law of Moses that are not about injuries to the body, but they're about harm to property. So if one of your sheep is taken, then you have a right to have a certain number of sheep back. So the lex talionis was about injuries to the body. So St. Augustine says there's that step of only being content to have your enemy's eye knocked out by law if your eye was knocked out, and if you're content with that, then you're already doing a bit more than justice itself would require. But the better than that, the higher step than that, is to be willing to have less paid back. So if your eye was knocked out, say, this is St. Augustine, he says if your eye is knocked out and the judge determines that the other man's ear should be cut off as a penalty, then if you're content with that, then you're even better, because an ear is less than an eye. But a higher step is if you were content for nothing to be paid back. If your enemy had to pay nothing back, if you were content with that, then you would be even more admirable. And the highest step of all would be if you were not only were you content for nothing to be paid back, but that you were ready, if God willed it, to use your other eye. Reminds me a bit of Saint Francis de Sales, who obviously had reached this perfection and was able to say of himself once, truly, if my enemy were to take out one of my eyes, I would smile at him with the other, which is a remarkable thing. And obviously St. Augustine is not saying that we can, the judges at courts of law can just decide not to punish people, because we can't waive other people's rights, but we can always waive our own rights, and the willingness to do that where there's no other interests involved is a sign of great holiness. So that's St. Augustine's interpretation.
Remarkable indeed. Right. Next question. Did the law of Moses forbid polygamy?
Did it forbid polygamy? No, it didn't. And it assumed that at least sometimes it would happen, because there's a law about it in Deuteronomy, which is very interesting. It says that if a man's got two wives and he really likes one of them and he can't stand the other one, but his oldest child is from the wife that he doesn't like, then he's got to give the main part of his inheritance to the son of the wife he doesn't like. So he's got to follow the ordinary laws of inheritance. So it assumes that it's sometimes going to happen, but it doesn't. I don't think it says really. I can't remember any other laws that mention it. It's interesting though that it comes in Deuteronomy, so that also may be come under the heading of statutes that are not good, in the sense in which that phrase is used in Ezekiel. So it seems like the kind of thing like divorce and remarriage that God is making known that he's not as such going to punish. Now there could be individual cases in which it would be punished, if it resulted from sins of lust or something like that, or sins of contempt for your first wife. But at least at that period, it's not punished. Though it doesn't seem to be very common. at any stage in Israel's history. So I can't think of any case offhand which occurs after the time of Solomon. There may be cases, but I can't think of any, and that's about 1,000 years BC.
It does seem, though, that if one would presume that if polygamy is not forbidden, then it's really not so necessary to seek a divorce, because they're so if they, or how would that work together? I just wonder.
Well, the precept about divorce is famously general. It simply says if the man finds some uncleanness in her. And so the rabbis at the time of our Lord disputed about what that meant. There was a strict school and there was a lax school. So, if you were belong to the strict school, you might say that if it was only if she was guilty of idolatry or adultery, something very grave, and in that case, you wouldn't want to carry on living with her.
Yes. Yes, that makes sense. So there is one more question I can see here. Does the church teach that modern day finance, where mortgages and credit cards are rife, is immoral?
What the teaching on usury says is that it's a sin to require interest on a loan for no other reason than the loan itself. As far as I know, that is what credit card companies do. If you don't pay them at the end of the month, then they will charge interest on what they've lent you. Now that seems to me to come under the condemnation of usury. Mortgages, well, it depends. There are different types of mortgage, so I think it depends on the type. But again, if the bank is requiring you to pay interest simply in virtue of a loan, then yes. So if the agreement is that you have to pay back a sum greater than that's been lent to you, and if you default on that, then the bank not only takes your house but also takes your other possessions, or some of your other possessions, to make up to the total, then that seems to me to be a usurious contract. So I would say yes, that comes under the condemnation of usury.
That's pretty much the whole banking system today. But what would be then the principle to look out for in contracts? Is there a better one than another, or are they all, would they all be the same?
It's not really an area where I feel very confident. I mean, I think there are differences in between this Britain and the United States. I think that, as far as I understand it, if you default on your mortgage payments, then you're not under such obligations under most US mortgage arrangements. So I may be wrong about that. So I recommend that you find someone who's more competent to answer that particular question.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think these are the questions for today. And that's our time up as well. Exactly an hour, a very fascinating and instructive hour it has been. So thank you very much, Father Crean, and thank you everyone for your participation today. The video of this lesson will be made available on the Family and Life Academy website, along with study notes and other resources. And we look forward to seeing you for lesson 3, where we shall see how the law of Moses prepared the way for Christ and how it was fulfilled by him. We shall consider what the Church has said about whether it is permissible today for Christians to observe the old law. And we shall also see how Jesus Christ is the giver of a new law, as well as a new priesthood, which together form the new and eternal covenant. In the meantime, please look out for other courses available at the Family and Life Academy. And a big thank you again to Father Green. We look forward to learning more from you next time.